You're too stupid to understand a simple order." Jim Cordwell's voice boomed across the dining room, his face twisted with rage as he towered over a young waitress. Every conversation stopped. Crystal glasses froze mid-sip. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl had descended over the room as one of America's most powerful CEOs publicly humiliated a girl who couldn't have been older than 22. Naomi Gibson stood there, water pitcher trembling in her hands, her face burning with shame as dozens of eyes watched her being destroyed. She whispered apologies that fell on deaf ears as Jim continued his verbal assault, his voice dripping with contempt for someone he saw as beneath him. But in the corner of the restaurant, something shifted. An older gentleman, quietly dining alone, slowly placed his napkin on the table. He removed his glasses with deliberate precision and stood up. There was something about the way he moved that commanded attention, something that suggested this wasn't just any businessman. Jim Cordwell had no idea he was about to lose everything. But here's what makes this story absolutely insane. That quiet gentleman in the corner wasn't just any random customer. His identity would flip this entire situation upside down and turn Jim Cordwell's world into his worst nightmare. If you want to see how one moment of cruelty can destroy a billionaire's life, hit that subscribe button, because this story will blow your mind. And tell me in the comments, have you ever witnessed someone powerful treating service workers terribly? Because what you're about to hear will make you think twice about how we treat people. The confrontation was just beginning, and Jim Cordwell was about to discover that some people you should never, ever underestimate. To understand how Jim Cordwell lost $3.5 billion in a single moment, you need to know who he really was. This wasn't just some rich guy having a bad day. This was a predator who had built his entire empire on the suffering of others. Jim Cordwell was the kind of CEO who made headlines for all the wrong reasons. His tech company dominated Silicon Valley not through innovation, but through systematically crushing every competitor in his path. He was famous for his boardroom executions, public meetings where he would humiliate executives in front of their peers before firing them. Industry insiders called it the Cordwell method: break people down psychologically, then profit from their weakness. His personal life was equally toxic. His ex-wife had fled with their daughter Ella after years of emotional abuse disguised as high standards. He hadn't spoken to his daughter in 3 years, and the last conversation had ended with her telling him she was ashamed to share his name. But Jim saw this as proof of his philosophy. Weakness, even in his own family, deserved punishment. At 52, he lived alone in a penthouse worth $40 million, surrounded by awards and accolades that couldn't fill the void where his humanity should have been. He genuinely believed that people like waitresses, janitors, and retail workers existed solely to serve people like him. In his twisted worldview, treating them poorly was actually doing them a favor, teaching them their place in society's hierarchy. But that night, across the restaurant, sat a young woman who would shatter everything he believed about worth and power. Naomi Gibson was everything Jim wasn't: humble, hardworking, and genuinely brilliant. While he slept in silk sheets, she was working her third job of the day, having already completed a morning shift at a medical clinic and an afternoon studying for her MCAT retake. She was a pre-med student at Columbia with a perfect GPA, but that academic success came at a brutal cost. Her mother, diagnosed with advanced cancer 2 years earlier, required treatments that insurance barely covered. The medical bills were drowning their family, and Naomi had quietly sacrificed everything to keep her mother alive. She worked 70 hours a week across 3 jobs: medical research assistant by morning, tutor in the afternoon, and high-end server at night. What made her story even more heartbreaking was her dream. Naomi wanted to become a surgeon, following in the footsteps of her late father, who had died in a car accident when she was 16. She kept his stethoscope in her locker at the restaurant, a reminder of why she endured the condescending looks and dismissive treatment from wealthy customers who saw her as invisible. Despite her exhaustion, despite the crushing pressure, Naomi maintained straight A's in her pre-med courses. Her professors called her the most naturally gifted student they'd encountered in decades. But to the elite diners at restaurants like this, She was just another faceless service worker, someone whose intelligence, dreams, and struggles were completely irrelevant. That night, there was a third person in the restaurant whose presence would change everything. In the corner booth sat a man who appeared to be just another wealthy businessman. Expensive suit, quiet demeanor, the kind of understated elegance that suggested serious money. But he wasn't dining. He was watching, observing, taking mental notes of every interaction around him. This mysterious figure had specifically requested this particular restaurant, this particular evening, for a meeting that would reshape the tech industry. He sat alone, checking his watch occasionally, but his real attention was focused on the dynamics playing out between staff and customers. He watched how people treated those they perceived as beneath them, cataloging behaviors that would later prove crucial. The stage was set for a collision that would destroy lives and create legends. That evening started as the most important night of Jim Cordwell's career. He had arrived early for what he believed would be the crown jewel meeting of his business life, a sit-down with an anonymous investor who was prepared to buy his AI technology company for $3.5 billion. This wasn't just money. This acquisition would make him the wealthiest tech CEO in America, finally putting him ahead of rivals who had questioned his methods for years. The investor had made an unusual request. Instead of meeting in a boardroom or country club, he wanted to conduct business at this discreet, upscale restaurant. Jim found it odd, but didn't question it. $3.5 billion bought a lot of tolerance for eccentricity. But Jim had arrived already on edge. That afternoon, his lawyer had called with devastating news about his daughter Ella. She was getting married and had specifically requested that he not attend the wedding. The rejection had triggered something dark in him, a rage that he usually reserved for business rivals and incompetent employees. Meanwhile, Naomi was having the worst day of her life. That morning, her mother's oncologist had delivered crushing news. The cancer had spread, and they needed to begin an experimental treatment that would cost another $60,000. Insurance had denied the claim. Then, during her afternoon break between jobs, she had received her MCAT retake scores. Despite studying every free moment for months, exhaustion and stress had caused her to score lower than her first attempt. Medical school, her father's dream for her, seemed to be slipping further away. Her manager at the restaurant had already written her up twice for attitude problems, which really meant she looked tired and stressed instead of constantly cheerful while being treated poorly by customers. One more complaint would mean termination, and she couldn't afford to lose this job. The tips from serving wealthy diners were the only thing keeping her mother's treatments funded. The collision was inevitable. Naomi, running on 3 hours of sleep and 2 cups of coffee, was carrying a water pitcher to refill glasses and change his order when she approached Jim's table. He was aggressively reviewing presentation materials, muttering angrily about his daughter's wedding snub. As she reached across to fill his glass, her exhausted hand trembled. Water spilled across his presentation documents. What happened next wasn't just yelling. It was a full-scale psychological assault. Jim unleashed years of pent-up rage and disappointment on a young woman who had accidentally spilled water. But his attack went far beyond the accident. He attacked her intelligence, her appearance, her worth as a human being. The language he used carried undertones that made every person in the restaurant deeply uncomfortable. References to people like her and assumptions about her education and future that revealed his deepest prejudices. Other diners immediately began filming, but nobody intervened. They watched in horrified fascination as one of America's most powerful CEOs destroyed a young waitress who was frantically apologizing and trying to clean up the water. Naomi's face burned with humiliation, but she kept apologizing, kept trying to salvage the situation. She needed this job. Her mother needed this job. She swallowed her pride and begged for forgiveness from a man who saw her as less than human. But across the restaurant, the mysterious businessman was no longer just observing. He had seen enough. As Jim's tirade reached its peak, as Naomi's dignity was being stripped away piece by piece, the older gentleman made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He stood up, and everything was about to change. What started as public humiliation was about to become complete character assassination. Jim Cordwell had crossed a line that even the wealthy elite dining around him found disturbing. His attack on Naomi escalated from anger into something truly vicious. He didn't just criticize her service, he launched a calculated assault on her entire existence. Jim told her she was too stupid for college, that people like her would never amount to anything, that she should be grateful for jobs like this because it was all she'd ever be qualified for. His voice carried across the restaurant as he painted a picture of her future filled with failure and mediocrity. But then Jim made a threat that revealed just how powerful and cruel he really was. He pulled out his phone and began making calls right there at the table. He contacted the restaurant owner, demanding Naomi be fired immediately. Then he went further. He threatened to use his connections to have her blacklisted from every decent establishment in the city. He wanted to destroy not just her dignity but her ability to survive. The entire restaurant had gone silent. Servers huddled together, afraid to intervene. Wealthy diners sat frozen, phones recording, but too shocked or cowardly to speak up. Naomi stood there taking this abuse because she literally couldn't afford to fight back. Her mother's life depended on this job. That's when everything changed. The mysterious businessman in the corner had heard enough. He stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and commanding. As he approached Jim's table, there was something about his presence that made everyone in the restaurant stop and stare. This wasn't just another wealthy customer. This was someone who radiated real power. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried the weight of absolute authority. He looked directly at Jim and said words that would haunt the CEO forever. "Mr. Cordwell, I believe we had a meeting scheduled." Jim looked up, confused and irritated by the interruption. "Who the hell are you?" The older gentleman smiled calmly and extended his hand. "Nathaniel Gibson. I'm the investor you've been trying to impress for the past 6 months." The color drained from Jim's face. This was his $3.5 billion deal, standing right in front of him. But then Nathaniel turned to Naomi, and his expression softened completely. "Hello, sweetheart. I'm sorry I'm late." The entire restaurant gasped as the truth hit them like a thunderbolt. The mysterious billionaire investor wasn't just any businessman. He was Naomi's grandfather. But the shocks weren't over. As whispers spread through the dining room, people began to realize who Nathaniel Gibson really was. He had built one of the largest tech empires in history, but unlike Jim, he had done it quietly, without fanfare or public attention. His company's innovations powered half the internet, and his net worth of $47 billion made Jim look like a small-time entrepreneur. Naomi stared at her grandfather in shock. She had known he was successful, but she had no idea he was this successful. He had been absent from her life for years, focusing on business while she and her mother struggled. But now he was here, and everything was about to change. Something awakened in Naomi in that moment. Years of being dismissed, overlooked, and treated as invisible suddenly transformed into a blazing confidence. She straightened her shoulders and looked directly at Jim Cordwell. When she spoke, her voice was steady and sharp as a blade. She quoted Jim's own business philosophy back to him, words he had said in interviews about success requiring the elimination of weakness. She pointed out that according to his own logic, his inability to control his emotions and treat people with respect was the ultimate weakness. She systematically dismantled his character using his own principles, revealing an intelligence that left everyone in the room stunned. The terrified waitress was gone. In her place stood a brilliant young woman who had found her voice at exactly the right moment. If you're loving this incredible story of justice and revenge, smash that subscribe button, because what happens next will absolutely blow your mind. And tell me in the comments, do you think Naomi's grandfather planned this entire encounter? Or was it just perfect timing? Nathaniel Gibson had spent decades building his empire, but more importantly, he had spent decades studying human nature. He explained to the entire restaurant that he never made major business deals without first observing how potential partners treated people they perceived as powerless. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a test that Jim had failed spectacularly. He revealed that he had been researching Jim's background for months. The public humiliation tactics, the destroyed careers, the pattern of cruelty disguised as business strategy. Nathaniel had heard rumors about Jim's character, but he needed to see it for himself before making any decisions about their potential partnership. "I have a simple rule," Nathaniel announced to the silent restaurant. "I don't do business with people who attack my family." With those words, he calmly informed Jim that the $3.5 billion deal was permanently canceled. The acquisition that would have made Jim the wealthiest tech CEO in America had just evaporated because he couldn't control his temper with a waitress. The realization hit Jim like a physical blow. 6 months of negotiations, millions spent on preparation, his entire future, all destroyed in a matter of minutes. He began scrambling desperately, trying to salvage the situation with fake apologies and excuses. He claimed he was having a bad day, that this wasn't who he really was, that he would do anything to make it right. But it was too late. Other diners were already posting videos to social media. The hashtags began trending within minutes. Jim's stock price, which had been soaring in anticipation of the acquisition announcement, started plummeting as leaked footage of his meltdown spread across the internet. Meanwhile, something beautiful was happening between Naomi and her grandfather. Nathaniel revealed that he had been quietly watching her progress for years, following her academic achievements and her sacrifices for her mother. He had known about her struggles, but had wanted to see if she had the strength to overcome them on her own. He was proud of what he saw. Not just her intelligence, but her character. Her resilience, her refusal to give up despite impossible circumstances. Right there in the restaurant, in front of everyone, he made her an offer that changed everything. Full funding for medical school. Complete coverage of her mother's treatments at the best cancer center in the country. A research position at his company's medical technology division. Everything she had been fighting for, handed to her because she had proven herself worthy through years of quiet heroism. Naomi's transformation was complete. She removed her server's apron with dignity, looked around the restaurant filled with people who had watched her being humiliated, and thanked them for the lesson in how not to treat others. She had become a symbol of hidden strength, revealing itself, proof that you never know who you're talking to or what they're capable of achieving. As grandfather and granddaughter walked out together, Jim Cordwell sat alone at his table, surrounded by the wreckage of his empire, finally understanding that his cruelty hadn't made him powerful. It had made him powerless. The $3.5 billion lesson was just beginning. His company's stock price didn't just drop, it went into free fall. Investors were panic selling as the market realized that the $3.5 billion acquisition deal was dead. By morning, his company had lost over 60% of its value. Decades of building wealth evaporated in a single trading day. But the financial devastation was just the beginning. Jim's board of directors called an emergency meeting at 6 a.m. These were people who had tolerated his aggressive tactics when they were profitable, but public relations disasters of this magnitude were different. They couldn't be associated with someone who had become a symbol of corporate cruelty. The meeting lasted exactly 12 minutes. Jim Cordwell was removed as CEO, stripped of his voting rights, and banned from company premises. His severance package, worth hundreds of millions, was frozen, pending multiple investigations into his conduct and company practices. Major clients began canceling contracts within hours. Tech companies that had relied on his services for years suddenly discovered they couldn't afford to be associated with his brand. Government contracts worth billions were terminated. International partnerships dissolved. His business empire, built on fear and intimidation, crumbled the moment people realized they no longer had to be afraid of him. The personal destruction was even more brutal. His daughter Ella, who had been planning her wedding, saw the footage on social media before anyone could warn her. She watched her father publicly humiliate a young woman who was working multiple jobs to pay for her mother's cancer treatment. A situation eerily similar to challenges Ella herself had faced when her father refused to help with her college expenses. That night, Ella posted a statement on her social media that went viral almost as quickly as her father's meltdown. She publicly disowned him, explaining that this behavior was exactly why she had cut him out of her life years earlier. She detailed a pattern of emotional abuse and cruelty that painted a picture of a man who had been destroying lives long before that restaurant incident. Meanwhile, Naomi Gibson was experiencing the most transformative week of her life. She had walked out of that restaurant with her dignity intact and her future secured. But more importantly, she had found her voice and her purpose. The next morning, she submitted her resignation to the restaurant with a letter that went viral when her coworkers shared it online. She thanked her fellow servers for their support, but explained that no one should have to endure the treatment she had experienced. She called for systemic changes in how service workers are treated and protected. But Naomi's transformation went beyond personal success. She had become a symbol of hidden potential and quiet strength. Speaking requests poured in from universities, conferences, and advocacy organizations. Her message was simple but powerful. Respect costs nothing, but its absence can cost everything. She began speaking at events about the invisible struggles of working students, the dignity of service work, and the importance of treating every person as if they might be someone extraordinary, because they very well might be. The ripple effects of that single evening continued expanding in ways no one could have predicted. The restaurant where the incident occurred immediately implemented a zero-tolerance anti-harassment policy. Any customer who mistreated staff would be permanently banned, regardless of their wealth or status. The policy became a model that restaurants across the country began adopting. Restaurants, hotels, and retail establishments found themselves under unprecedented pressure to protect their employees. Companies that failed to implement proper policies faced boycotts and public shaming. The entire service industry was being forced to reckon with a culture of abuse that had been normalized for generations. Nathaniel Gibson, witnessing the movement his granddaughter had inspired, decided to do something that would create lasting change. He announced the creation of the Gibson Foundation for Working Students, a scholarship program specifically designed for students like Naomi who were working multiple jobs to fund their education. Within 6 months, the foundation had received over 100,000 applications from students across the country. Each application told a story of determination, sacrifice, and dreams, deferred but never abandoned. Nathaniel realized he hadn't just created a scholarship program, he had revealed an entire hidden population of extraordinary people who had been overlooked simply because they weren't born into privilege. The contrast between the two paths couldn't have been more stark. Jim Cordwell's cruelty had destroyed everything he had built, while Naomi's grace under pressure had opened doors to opportunities she had never imagined possible. One moment of character revelation had determined two completely different destinies. But this story wasn't over yet. The most surprising twist was still to come, and it would involve the next generation in ways that nobody could have predicted. 6 months after the night that destroyed his empire, Jim Cordwell was living a life he never could have imagined. The penthouse was gone, sold to pay legal fees and settlements. The fleet of luxury cars had been liquidated. The private jet was a memory. He now lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Queens, taking the subway to therapy sessions 3 times a week. His company had eventually been sold, but for a fraction of its original value. The buyers got it for $800 million, a devastating loss from the $3.5 billion valuation he had been so close to achieving. The remaining money, after debts and legal settlements, left him comfortable, but no longer wealthy by billionaire standards. The therapy sessions were the hardest part. For the first time in his adult life, Jim was being forced to confront the deep insecurities and childhood traumas that had turned him into a predator. His therapist, Dr. Sarah Martinez, didn't treat him like a powerful CEO. She treated him like a broken human being who needed to rebuild his relationship with empathy and respect. The sessions revealed a pattern that went back decades. Jim's cruelty hadn't made him successful. His success had given him permission to be cruel. He had used his wealth and power as weapons to avoid dealing with his own feelings of inadequacy and abandonment. Every person he had humiliated had been a projection of his own self-hatred. The most painful part was attempting to reconcile with his daughter Ella. She had agreed to occasional phone calls, but only on the condition that he was actively working on himself and could demonstrate real change. Their conversations were awkward and often ended with her hanging up when he slipped back into old patterns of blame and defensiveness. But something was different about Jim during these calls. The arrogance was gone. The condescension had been replaced by genuine remorse. He was learning, slowly and painfully, how to take responsibility for the damage he had caused. Meanwhile, Naomi Gibson was living a life that seemed almost too good to be true. Except she had earned every moment of it through years of sacrifice and determination. She was not just succeeding in medical school, she was dominating it. Her professors were amazed by her combination of natural talent and work ethic. Despite no longer needing to work 3 jobs, she maintained the discipline and focus that had carried her through her darkest moments. Her mother's recovery had been nothing short of miraculous. The experimental treatment at Memorial Sloan Kettering had eliminated the cancer completely. For the first time in years, Naomi could focus on her own dreams without the constant fear of losing the person who meant everything to her. She had also found love in an unexpected place. Brian Thompson, a fellow medical student, had been drawn to her not because of her family's wealth, but because of her story of resilience. He respected her journey and understood that her strength came from surviving challenges he had never faced. Their relationship was built on mutual admiration and shared values rather than superficial attraction. But, perhaps most importantly, Naomi had found her calling beyond medicine. She was becoming one of the most sought-after speakers in the country, addressing conferences about hidden potential, workplace dignity, and the importance of treating every person with respect. Her message resonated because it came from lived experience rather than academic theory. Universities invited her to speak to students about perseverance. Corporate conferences brought her in to discuss leadership and character. Her grandfather's foundation used her as their primary spokesperson, and her story had inspired thousands of working students to pursue their dreams despite seemingly impossible circumstances. Then came the twist that no one saw coming. During her second year of medical school, Naomi was leading a study group for first-year students when a new member joined. The young woman was brilliant, hardworking, and seemed to carry herself with a mixture of confidence and humility that Naomi immediately respected. Her name was Ella Cordwell. Ella had enrolled in medical school using her mother's maiden name, wanting to establish her own identity separate from her father's toxic legacy. She had no idea that the study group leader whose story had inspired her to pursue medicine was the same waitress her father had tried to destroy. For weeks, the 2 young women became close friends. Ella admired Naomi's dedication and authenticity, while Naomi appreciated Ella's intelligence and genuine desire to help people. They studied together, grabbed coffee between classes, and shared stories about their families, though Ella was careful to avoid mentioning her father's name. The truth came out during a casual conversation about family backgrounds. When Ella finally admitted who her father was, expecting Naomi to reject her friendship, something beautiful happened instead. Naomi saw in Ella everything that Jim could have been: compassionate, humble, genuinely caring about others. Rather than holding Ella responsible for her father's actions, Naomi embraced her even more tightly. She recognized that Ella was trying to build a life based on values that were the complete opposite of everything Jim represented. When Jim learned about this friendship during one of his phone calls with Ella, it forced him to confront his prejudices in the most personal way possible. The young woman he had tried to destroy was now mentoring his daughter, helping her succeed in ways he never had. Naomi was treating Ella with the respect and support that he had failed to provide as a father. As this incredible saga reached its conclusion, the lessons became crystal clear. Jim Cordwell had learned the hardest way possible that respect costs nothing, but its absence can cost everything. One moment of cruelty had destroyed decades of building, proving that character matters more than wealth, power, or status. If this story of transformation and redemption has moved you, hit that subscribe button, because there are so many more incredible stories of justice and second chances coming your way.